The drill broke at the worst possible time. Darren Cole was 300 meters underground when the main bit snapped clean off the housing and the whole machine shuddered like something dying. He shut it down, pulled out his lamp, and started the long walk back up through the tunnel alone. He did not call for help. He never did. It was easier to fix things himself than to explain what was wrong to someone who would only half listen. He reached the surface at around the 3rd hour of night. The sky above Calder 9 was the color of old iron, thin clouds moving fast on the high wind. The moon had no real weather to speak of, just dust and cold and the occasional pressure storm that rattled the colony's outer walls. He stood outside the tunnel entrance for a moment and breathed the recycled outside air, which tasted of copper and nothing else. He was walking back toward the workshop when the sky cracked open. Not with sound at first, just light. A streak of silver-white cutting through the clouds from high above, spinning as it fell, leaving a burning trail that faded almost instantly in the thin air. Darren stopped walking. He watched it. For a moment, he thought it was debris from one of the ore freighters that passed through the outer belt twice a month. Then it moved wrong. Debris did not pull its shape together mid-fall. Debris did not twist as if trying to slow itself down. Whatever it was alive. It hit the eastern ore field with a sound that traveled through the ground before it reached his ears. A low, heavy thud that he felt in his boots. Then dust. A long rising column of it, silver in the colony's perimeter lights. He ran. He was not young and he was not fast, but he ran anyway, because that was what a person did when something fell out of the sky and you were the only one awake to see it. The trench it left was 30 meters long and half as wide, torn through solid rock as if the ground had simply opened its mouth and then closed again. At the far end of the trench, something moved in the dust, something that breathed in ragged, uneven pulls, something with wings folded wrong, one pressed flat against the rock and one hanging at an angle that made Darren's stomach drop just looking at it. It was a dragon. He had seen pictures. Everyone who lived in frontier space had seen pictures. The Dracari Dominion used them in war. They were weapons of the deep systems, creatures bred for size and fire and obedience. In every picture he had ever seen, they were enormous and dark and terrifying. This one was the size of a ground loader. Her scales were silver white, faintly luminous, and she was shaking. Not from aggression, from pain and fear. Her left wing hung at the wrong angle. Her foreleg was pulled up close to her chest, and she held it there the way a person holds a broken arm. Her eyes found him in the dark, and they were wide and bright, and absolutely terrified. She scrambled backward, caught her injured wing on a rock, and made a sound that was not a roar. It was something much smaller than a roar. The colony alarm went off. 3 long pulses, which meant unknown contact on the perimeter. Lights came on all along the eastern wall. Darren could already hear Bronze Salt's voice crackling across the comm channel, calling for his security team, asking for a location, using the hard, flat voice he used when he was trying not to sound alarmed. Darren did not answer his comm. He stood at the edge of the trench, about 15 meters from the dragon, and he did not move. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak. He just stood there, with his lamp at his side, and let her look at him. She pressed herself as far back as the end of the trench allowed. Her tail curled around her injured side. Her eyes never left him. She was waiting for something. He did not know what. An attack, maybe. A trap. Some move that would tell her what he was going to do next. He did not make one. Behind him, boots on rock, Bronze Salt arrived with 4 people, all carrying pulse rifles, all pointed at the trench. Bronze started to say something sharp and military. "Lower them," Darren said. "Cole, that is a Dracari. She is hurt and she is scared, and if you point those at her she is going to panic, and then we are going to have a very bad night. Lower them." Bronze was quiet for a moment. Then, reluctantly, he gave the order. Darren sat down on the edge of the trench. Just sat down, right there on the cold rock, as if he had nowhere else to be. He set his lamp beside him. He did not look away from the dragon, but he did not stare hard either. He just looked. She watched him sit. Her shaking slowed, just slightly. He stayed there until the sky started going pale at the edge. She never moved toward him. She never moved away. But somewhere in that long quiet, she stopped waiting for the worst to happen. She just watched him, the way something watches when it cannot yet decide if a thing is safe, but cannot afford to stop watching it either. That was how the first day ended. Not with a word. Not with a dramatic moment. Just a man sitting on a rock in the cold, and a silver dragon at the bottom of a trench, and the slow turning of a moon that did not care what either of them decided next. She moved into the collapsed processing bay on the second day. Nobody had told her she could. Nobody had told her she couldn't. The eastern section of the bay had been sealed after a ceiling collapse 3 months back, and the colony had not yet gotten around to clearing it. There was a gap in the outer wall, wide enough for her to push through sideways, and she had found it on her own. Darren discovered this when he arrived at the trench in the morning and found it empty. He tracked the marks in the dust without much trouble. He had grown up on a farming world where you learned to read the ground or you lost livestock. The marks led to the gap in the processing bay wall. He stood outside it for a moment, listening. He could hear her breathing in the dark inside, slow and careful, like she was trying to make as little noise as possible. He did not go in. He set down the container of protein rations he had brought, mining grade, high calorie, not meant to taste like anything in particular, just inside the gap. Then he stepped back and went to work on the broken drill, which he had dragged out of the tunnel and set up on a flat section of ground nearby. He worked for 4 hours. The dragon did not come out. The food disappeared at some point when he was not looking directly at the gap. He pretended not to notice. He came back that evening. He brought more food. He sat outside the gap for an hour, doing nothing except reading from the battered technical manual he carried everywhere. Then he went home. He did this for 3 days. Willa Grosh found him on the 4th morning, setting out the food container with the calm efficiency of someone completing a routine task. She was 61 years old, had been a medic on 3 different frontier postings, and was not easily surprised. She looked at the gap in the wall. She looked at Darren. "How bad is the wing?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said. "She is favoring the left joint. I have not gotten close enough to see the full damage. She is going to need treatment." "I know. You cannot rush it." "I know that too." Willa nodded and said nothing else about it. What she did say something about was the memo that arrived that afternoon from the senior colony administrator, a man named Pruitt, who had filed a formal report with the Frontier Settlements Authority flagging the presence of a Dracary creature within colony bounds. The memo requested a response team and used the word containment 4 times in 6 paragraphs. Willa blocked it at every level she had access to, which was most of them. "You cannot block a formal FSA request indefinitely," Braun told her, standing in her office doorway with his arms crossed. "Watch me," she said, and went back to her paperwork. Inside the bay, Riva was not sleeping. She had not slept well since before the Dominion transport ship lost power and sent her tumbling through atmosphere toward a moon she had never heard of. Sleep meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant that whatever was going to happen to her would happen faster. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the colony. It was strange to her how much noise humans made just by existing. Machines running, voices in conversation, the metal walls of the colony sighing in temperature shifts. She had been raised in a facility that was always either silent or loud with orders. The sounds here were different. They were not aimed at anything. They were just sounds of people living. The man came every day. He never came inside. He never called to her or made any effort to draw her out. He just left food and did something quiet nearby and then left. In the Dominion facility, when handlers came, they came with purposes: evaluation, feeding schedules, physical measurement. Every interaction had a point, and the point was never about her. She had learned to read what was about to happen by the way they moved when they approached her pen. This man moved like nothing was about to happen. She thought about the first night, when she had been shaking in the trench and he had just sat down. She had waited for the punishment of something, for the leash or the order or the sharp command to hold still. It had not come. He had just sat there like sitting was the whole plan. She did not know what to do with that. On the 4th day, she moved to the edge of the gap while he was working. Not outside, just to the edge, where the light came in. She watched him work on a large piece of machinery laid out on the ground. His hands moved with the same kind of quiet that the rest of him had. He made a mistake at one point, cursed softly at the machine, and then corrected it without drama. He did not look up at her. But the angle of his shoulders changed, just slightly, in a way that told her he knew she was there. She stayed at the edge for almost an hour. Then she went back to her corner and lay down. Her wing ached. Her leg ached. But something else had shifted, something she did not have a name for, something that felt like the very first, very fragile edge of a question she was not yet brave enough to finish asking. Out on the field, Darren Cole packed up his tools and walked home. He did not smile about it. He did not tell anyone. He had learned a long time ago that some things you keep quiet, because if you say them out loud before they are ready, they break apart before they ever get a chance to be real. Willa noticed the wing was getting worse before Darren admitted it. She had started coming with him in the mornings, sitting a little further back, not engaging, just present. A body that was not a threat. She watched the way Riva moved inside the gap of the processing bay, and she saw what Darren was also seeing but was not yet willing to name. The left wing was being held tighter each day. Not because it hurt less, because it hurt more, and she was bracing for it. If that joint sets wrong, she will never fly right, Willa said. Darren said nothing. She needs to let us close enough to look at it. She will, he said, when she decides to. 3 more days passed. On the 7th day since her arrival, Riva came out. Not all the way. She pushed through the gap in the wall and stood in the open for the first time, blinking against the pale morning light of Calder 9. She was bigger than she had looked in the trench. Even injured, even with her wing held wrong and her legs still pulled close to her chest, she was a real physical presence. The silver of her scales caught the light in a way that made her look like something poured out of a cold star. She looked at Darren. He was sitting on his usual rock with his technical manual. He looked up at her. Then he looked back at the manual. She walked toward him, slowly, unevenly. She stopped about 3 meters away and stood there. Then she lowered her head toward the kit of supplies he had quietly set on the ground nearby 2 days ago. Medical grade. Antiseptic cloth. A brace assembly Willa had built out of parts from the equipment bay. She sniffed at it. Looked at him again. He set the manual down. He picked up the antiseptic cloth. He held it up so she could see it. He did not move toward her. He just showed it to her. She stepped closer. What followed took most of the morning, and none of it was fast. Willa joined them after a while, moving slowly and saying very little. Between the two of them, speaking in low voices, they worked around Riva's wing with the kind of patience that most people do not have for machines, let alone for a creature that could end the interaction violently at any moment. Riva was not violent. She was tense in a way that radiated off her like heat, but she held still. She flinched. She pulled back twice, but she came back both times. Then Darren's hand slipped. He was repositioning the brace housing, and his grip missed, and his elbow caught the joint wrong, and Riva made a sound like a crack and a cry at the same time and threw herself sideways. The movement knocked a whole shelf of tools off the crate they were balanced on, and everything went crashing to the ground, and Riva backed up fast against the outer wall of the bay with her wings half spread, one up and one dragging, and her eyes wide and fixed on Darren. She was ready. She had been ready this whole time, somewhere underneath the trying. Ready for this to turn into the thing she expected. The correction. The retaliation. The consequence. Darren crouched down and started picking up the tools. One at a time. He set them back on the crate. When he had them all, he straightened up, looked at Riva, and said, "Sorry, that was my fault." Riva stared at him. Willa was still. She understood what she was watching. Riva had no framework for what had just happened. She had been hit. She had reacted, and the human had picked up his tools and apologized. To her. For causing her pain. As if her pain was something that mattered to him. As if causing it by accident was something he needed to correct. In the facility, when handlers made mistakes during evaluations, they blamed the subject. Always. It was the creature that had moved wrong, reacted wrong, held the wrong position. The fault was never on the handler's side. Riva stood against the wall for a long time. Then she walked back over, slowly, and lowered her wing toward the brace again. Darren picked up the housing and kept working. They finished the brace that afternoon. It was not a perfect fit, but it held the joint in the right position and took some of the strain off the surrounding muscle. Riva stood with it on for a while, shifting her weight, testing it. Then she turned her head and looked at it directly, examining it the way she examined everything, with complete and quiet focus. She turned the same look on Darren. He met it without flinching. "She is going to want to understand how it works," Willa said quietly. "Let her," Darren said. Word had spread through the colony, the way things always spread in small settlements where there was not much else to talk about. By evening, some of the younger colonists had started drifting past the eastern bay during their off hours just to look. Bronze Salt had stationed himself at a respectful distance with a scanner and the resigned expression of a man who had already lost the argument and knew it. Two children, siblings named Oro and Fen, had started leaving things outside the processing bay gap. A flat piece of colored metal. A drawing done on packing paper. Riva noticed them. She did not touch them. But the next morning, the drawing was inside the bay. Nobody mentioned it. Not even Darren. And somewhere in the outer system, on a long sensor sweep, a bronze-class Drakkari vessel had just registered the faint trace signature of silver-white scale biomatter on a moon called Calder 9 and changed course. The message arrived on a colony-wide channel, which meant everyone heard it at once. It was short, formal galactic common, spoken in the flat tone of Dominion military dispatch. It said that a Drakkari hatchling, identification number 7 of 11 from the 9th breeding cohort, had gone absent during a transport failure and was believed to have made landfall in this sector. It said the hatchling was Dominion property and was to be held for retrieval. It said that failure to comply would be treated as interference with a military asset. It did not use the word she. It did not use a name. The colony meeting happened the same evening, in the main hall, which was not big enough for everyone, but they came anyway. People stood in the corridor outside and listened through the open door. Pruitt, the administrator, spoke first. He said the logical thing. They were 200 people on a frontier moon with no warship, no defense platform, and no treaty status with the Drakkari Dominion. The practical choice was clear. He said the word liability 3 times and protocol twice, and did not once say the word her. Bronze Salt spoke after him. He did not want to. He stood up slowly and said that he was a security officer and his job was to protect the people in this colony, and a Dominion warship entering this system over a refusal was a threat he could not answer. He said he was not happy about it. He sat down looking like a man who had swallowed something bad. Willa spoke last. She did not use many words. She said, "We all know what the Dominion does with things it considers defective. We have known since she arrived that she was not lost. She was thrown away. So the question is not about liability or protocol. The question is whether we are the kind of people who hand a frightened child back to the people who decided she was not worth keeping." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then people started voting. It was not unanimous. 11 people voted to comply with the Dominion's request. The rest voted to refuse and file for formal mediation through the Frontier Settlements Authority. It was the kind of vote that left marks. Pruitt did not look at Willow when it was done. Darren was not at the meeting. He had already left. He walked to the processing bay in the dark and sat down just outside the gap in the wall. He could hear Riva inside, the steady rhythm of her breathing. He did not know if she understood what had been said on the colony channel. He did not know how much galactic common she had picked up, or whether Dominion hatchlings were taught it at all. He sat down and he talked to her. Not about the vote, not about the Dominion ship. He talked about his daughter, Sela. He talked about how she used to take apart every machine she could reach, from the time she could walk. He talked about losing her, about the particular silence that followed, about how he had come to frontier postings one after another because staying still in familiar places hurt too much, about how fixing things had become the one thing that still made sense, because broken things at least gave you a direction. He did not know how much Riva understood. But at some point during the talking, a sound came from inside the bay. Soft. Not a word. Not really a response. Just a sound that said, "I am here and I am listening." Riva, in the dark, was trying to understand what grief was. She knew loss, technically. She had watched hatchlings disappear from the facility and understood they were not coming back. But she had not been allowed to stay near any of them long enough for it to matter. Closeness was not permitted. Attachment was considered a developmental problem, something to be evaluated and corrected. What Darren described was something else. Something that went on for years. Something that changed how a person moved through the world. She turned it over in her mind while he talked, the way she turned mechanical problems over, from every angle, until the shape of it became clear. He had lost something small that he loved. And he had kept going anyway. And he was still going. Right now, sitting outside a gap in a broken wall in the dark, talking to a creature he had known for less than 2 weeks, because she was there and he had decided that mattered. After a long time, she moved to the edge of the gap. She did not come outside. She just moved close enough that the distance between them was almost nothing. She did not touch him. She laid her head on the ground near his hand. close enough that he could have reached out if he wanted. He did not reach out. He just kept talking, quieter now, about nothing much, about the drill he was fixing and the cold that was coming, and the funny way the twin moons of Calder 9 looked when they were both up at the same time. And Riva stayed. And that was the thing that stayed with her afterward, not the words, not the grief, but the fact that he had come to where she was, in the dark, and had not asked her for anything. Not obedience, not gratitude, not the performance of something she did not feel. He had just come because she was there. She was still thinking about that when the Dominion vessel crossed into the Calder 9 system at dawn. Galvern landed on the colony platform like weather arriving. His ship was not the largest Dominion vessel, but on a frontier moon that had never hosted anything bigger than an or freighter, it filled the sky in a way that made even bronze salt stand very still for a moment. The landing ramp came down. Galvern walked out alone. He was old. That was the first thing anyone noticed. The second thing was the scars. Long, healed-over lines across his shoulders and neck, the kind that came from decades of real combat, not training. His bronze dark scales had a faded quality, the color of something that had once been brighter. He moved with the particular slowness of a creature who had stopped trying to look impressive, because he did not need to. He stopped at the base of the ramp and looked at the colony. At the prefab walls. The equipment scattered across the yard. The humans who had come out to watch him, none of them in military formation, most of them just standing around like this was a community event. Willa Grosh walked out to meet him. She came alone, without armor, without weapons, with her medic's satchel on one shoulder and a container of water in her hand. She stopped about 2 meters from him, looked up at a creature 4 times her height, and said, "Long trip. You must be thirsty." Galvern looked at the water container for a moment. He said, "I am here for the hatchling." "I know," Willa said, "and we will talk about that. But it is a long way from the outer belt, and I am offering you water, so perhaps start there." He took the water. He did not drink it immediately. He held it and looked at her with the expression of someone trying to determine what category of opponent they were dealing with. Willa let him look. They talked on the platform for 20 minutes. Then Galvern said he wanted to see the hatchling. Not a request. Darren brought Riva out. She came through the bay gap slowly, with her brace still on, her steps careful on the uneven ground. When she saw Galvern, she stopped walking. Every muscle in her body went rigid. She had not seen a Dominion elder in the flesh since the facility, and the last one she had seen had put a mark on her record that meant death. Galvern looked at her. He read her the way evaluators always had, starting with scale color, moving to frame size, checking the wing spread, noting the injury. His face did not change. He began reciting her deficiencies from memory. Silver coloration, non-standard. Frame size, below threshold. Fire development, untested. Wingspan, suboptimal. Riva held still. She had heard this list before. She had heard it many times. She braced for what came after the list. It was always the same. The judgment, the dismissal, the mark on the record. She had learned not to react. Reacting made it worse. Then Darren stepped forward. He did not step in front of her, exactly. He just moved to stand beside her, close enough that their proximity was clear. He looked at Galvern, who was twice his height, and could have ended the conversation in any number of permanent ways, and he said, "She fixed a relay coupling in the east tunnel last week. I showed her once. One time. And she did it perfectly. I do not know what you see when you look at her, but I see someone who learns fast and cares about doing things right." Galvern went quiet. It was a specific kind of quiet. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. The quiet of someone who had just heard something they did not expect and were deciding what to do with it. He said, "Why do you speak of her this way? She is not yours." Darren said, "She was in front of me and she needed help." That was enough. Galvern looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Riva, and something moved behind his eyes, something old and complicated, and then he pulled it back and it was gone. He said he would return in the morning. He took his water and walked back up the ramp. That night, Darren stayed late in the workshop. Riva had started coming inside to watch him work over the past few days. She would sit near the doorway, just inside, and follow every motion with her eyes. She was particularly interested in the mechanical problems, the things that did not work and needed to be figured out. There was a cooling vent on the east wall that Darren had been fighting with for a week. It kept jamming in the closed position, and he had pulled it apart twice and still had not found the root cause. He had left it disassembled on his bench, partly out of frustration, and had moved on to other things. He was calibrating a pressure sensor when he heard a sound from behind him, a soft series of clicks, then a hiss of air, which meant the vent had opened. He turned around. Riva was sitting back from the bench, watching him. The vent was assembled and fully open. She had done it. She had watched him fail at it twice, turned the problem over in her mind for 3 days, and solved it. Darren looked at what she had done. He looked at the vent. He looked at her. He said it simply. No ceremony. No grand pause. He was tired and his hands were cold, and he was just a man in a workshop looking at something that had surprised him. He said, "I am proud of you." Riva went completely still. The words landed in her chest like something falling into deep water. She had heard commands. She had heard corrections. She had heard her deficiencies listed in order. She had heard the particular silence that meant she had failed again. She had never heard those words before. Not once. Not aimed at her. Not meaning her. Her scales flickered. A ripple of pale, iridescent light moving from her shoulders to the tip of her tail, which was a thing young silver dragons did when their emotions moved too fast for their bodies to contain. She could not stop it. She did not respond. She did not know how. Darren turned back to the pressure sensor and kept working, easy and quiet, as if he had not just rearranged the entire shape of her understanding of what words could do. Riva sat in the doorway all night, not sleeping. She just held the words in the dark and turned them over and could not put them down. Galvern came back at dawn, as he said he would. He came alone again. He did not go to the landing platform this time. He walked directly to the eastern bay, which told the colony that he had spent the night watching the settlement instead of resting. Bronsalt tracked him the whole way on sensors, hand on his comm, saying nothing. Riva was outside when Galvern arrived. She had not slept, and it showed in the set of her wings, the slow blink of her eyes. But she was standing, and she was not backed against a wall, and that was different from yesterday. Galvern stopped a short distance away from her. He looked at the brace on her wing. He looked at the drawings that Oro and Finn had left near the bay gap, which were now stacked in a careful pile she had moved and arranged herself. He said, "I would speak with you, without the humans." Darren, standing behind Riva, glanced at her. She gave no signal, but she did not move away from Galvern, which Darren took as close enough. He stepped back to the doorway of the workshop, far enough to give them distance, close enough that he was still visible. Galvern lowered his head to Riva's level. He was still much larger than her, but the lowering changed the shape of the conversation. He told her what she already knew, that she had been marked at 7 weeks old, that her color was flagged as non-standard, her frame as below viable threshold, that the transport she had been on was taking her to decommissioning, and the power failure that tumbled her through this moon's atmosphere had been the only reason she was still breathing. Then he told her what she did not know. He told her that silver scales were not a defect. They were the oldest coloration in the Dracari line, carried by the first dragons who ever made contact with other species, the ones who had been diplomats and scholars and builders before the Dominion decided that power was the only language worth speaking. The Dominion had spent 300 years selecting against silver in their breeding programs, because silver dragons talked too much and questioned too often and did not follow orders with sufficient enthusiasm. Riva stared at him. He said, "You were not defective. You were inconvenient." She did not speak immediately. She was turning it over, the way she turned every problem over. Then she said, in halting galactic common, with the careful pronunciation of someone who had been learning from listening rather than from instruction, "You came to take me back." Galvern said, "I came because I was sent. And now." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am telling you that if you return, you will not be punished for surviving. That is the most I am authorized to promise." Riva looked at him. Then she looked at the workshop doorway, where Darren was leaning against the frame. She looked at Willa, who had appeared from somewhere and was standing near the path with her arms folded. She looked at the drawings in their careful pile, at the colony walls, at the thin, pale sky. She looked back at Galvern. "I will not go back," she said, "to a place where nothing I do is ever enough." Galvern did not argue. He did not threaten. He stood there and looked at her for a long time with those old, tired eyes, and what was in them was not anger. Then he bent his head very slightly toward her, not a bow, exactly. Something smaller. Something private. He said, quietly enough that only she could hear. I had silver scales once. When I was young. The facility made me forget. I did not remember until I saw yours. He straightened. He turned and walked back toward his ship without another word. His ship left the system by midday. The Frontier Settlements Authority received the formal mediation request and opened a file. Bronsalt had already drafted the companion document, registering Riva as a protected resident under colonial charter. He filed it himself, without being asked. He dropped a copy on Darren's workbench, said nothing, and left. Darren found it and read it and set it down without comment. But he kept it. Over the weeks that followed, the bay was cleaned out and the ceiling collapse was repaired. The gap in the outer wall was widened officially and a ramp was added. The colony voted on this with very little debate. Pruitt abstained. Riva started learning to read from the maintenance manuals because they were what was available and because she was interested in the machines. She moved through them faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks, she was finding errors in the older volumes and marking them in the margins in small, precise characters that looked nothing like any written language in the colony's database. So she invented a notation system and Darren eventually learned to read it. She corrected his repair logs. He let her. She learned more galactic common every day. Most of it came from listening. Some of it came from Oro and Finn, who were not afraid of her and treated her with the matter-of-fact friendship that children extend to things they have decided are interesting. One afternoon, she found Willa sitting outside the med bay and asked her a question she had been carrying for weeks. She said, "What does proud mean?" "Exactly. As a definition." Willa thought about it. She did not answer fast, which Riva had come to understand meant the answer was going to be worth waiting for. Willa said, "It means someone watched you do something hard, and they were glad you exist." Riva was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Oh." She walked back to the workshop slowly. She sat with that definition for the rest of the day, and then for many days after that, in the same way she sat with difficult mechanical problems, turning it from every angle, checking every surface, testing whether it held weight. It held. That evening, Darren came out of the workshop and found her sitting on the roof in the dark, wings spread slightly to catch the warmth still rising from the solar panels, looking up at the twin moons of Calder 9. He got his folding chair from inside and set it up next to the ladder. He sat down. He did not have anything to say. He had spent the day fixing the tunnel drill, which was finally, after 3 weeks, actually fixed, and he was content in the way that a person is content when they have done one thing well. Riva looked down at him from the roof. Then she looked back up at the moons. They stayed like that for a long time, a man in a folding chair and a silver dragon on a rooftop, under a sky that had once brought her here falling and broken and alone. She was still here. She was staying. And somewhere in the deep quiet of that ordinary evening, with the machines humming inside and the children's voices carrying from across the yard and the cold, clean dark overhead, Riva understood something that the Dominion had spent 300 years trying to breed out of her line. That being seen clearly, by even one person, who looked at all of what you were and said it was enough. That was the thing worth surviving for.